Thank you, Senator Gallagher. Senator Humphries.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I'm grateful to Senator Gallagher for putting those matters on the table and explaining what he feels are the benefits of Labor's administration, but as questions in question time today very amply demonstrated, the problem with making promises like paid maternity leave and NDISs and so forth is that, worthy though they might be, you've got to deliver them sustainably. And to deliver those sorts of promises sustainably to the Australian people, you've got to have balanced budgets. That's at the very nub of these sort of processes, because without balanced budgets, you end up having to borrow money. And the coalition has made very clear that we stand for the kind of fiscal management which brings Australia back to sustainable, continuous budget surpluses of the kind that Australians saw almost without interruption throughout the days of the Howard government. That's the kind of process which brings Australians the real benefits that Senator Gallagher has spoken about. Because this government inherited a very strong fiscal position. It inherited $45 billion effectively of assets tucked away. It inherited no net debt, and it inherited a budget in surplus. And it's turned that, of course, around in just a few short years into massive deficits, into enormous amounts of debt. $107 billion worth of debt today, climbing upwards at the rate of about $100 million a day. $100 million a day, $1 billion every 10 days this government is in office. And the problem for the government is, of course, Mr Deputy President, that they face today a struggle towards the light to reach their surplus. It was supposed to be delivered, of course, this financial year. It was promised faithfully that it would be delivered. In fact, it was promised on more than one occasion that it had actually been delivered. I received in my letterbox a note from Senator Lundy, Community News, I gather with everybody else in the ACT, in which she said the 2012 federal budget has not only been returned to surplus as promised, it has ensured that families and small business will share in the benefits of the resources boom. Well, the budget has not been returned to surplus, and presumably she's referring there to the mining tax delivering benefits of the resources boom to families and small business. Of course, we know the mining tax has delivered nothing to the Australian people to date, not one penny. She went on to say at the bottom of her page, how do we compare on jobs and the economy? Under Labor, our budget has been returned to surplus in 2012-13. Well, we find a few months after that page was delivered in everybody's letterbox in the ACT that, in fact, actually it hasn't been returned to surplus. The budget is very much still in the red and looks like being in the red for quite some time to come. And I think Senator Gallagher and others on that side of the chamber who extol the virtues of the government's budget process need to understand that getting to a surplus this year or next year, whenever it's going to be, if they ever do it, and I have my doubts, but if they ever do it, getting to a surplus is just the beginning of their problems. Because once they get to a surplus, they've then got to start to use whatever that surplus is to pay for the mountain of promises which this government has already made to the Australian people, for which there is no plausible means of delivery. They promised an NDIS at a cost of $10.5 billion a year once fully operational. You're then paying another $3.7 billion in new money over 5 years for aged care. You promised low-paid workers another $1 billion. You promised to buy a number of key assets in defence, $36 billion for submarines and $16 billion for joint strike fighters. You haven't promised, but you've had to find the money to pay for your mistakes in border protection. You're now paying $2.1 billion to reopen Nauru and Manus Island refugee facility processing centres, and you're increasing the refugee intake, costing the Australian taxpayer $1.4 billion over the forward estimates. And of course, there's also Gonski at $6.5 billion a year once fully operational. Now, when you can't even reach a budget surplus 5 years after weathering a fiscal crisis, 5 years ago the GFC happened, you still today, 5 years later, can't get to a simple budget surplus or a wafer-thin budget surplus of $1.1 billion. How are you going to pay for those promises? This doesn't add up, Mr Deputy President. It doesn't add up. Labor's off the rails with this, and all
Thank
Australians
you,
can see that.
Senator Humphries. Your time has